Perfect. Can we start? Okay. Bueno, buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Esta es una actividad híbrida. Mi nombre es Roberto Saba. Soy profesor aquí en la Universidad de Palermo y en la Universidad de Buenos Aires, profesor de Derecho Constitucional. Y primero el tema idioma. Nuestro invitado va a hablar en inglés. Puede que haya gente que está esperando que yo hable en inglés y él, para entenderme, voy a usar el inglés yo también, para homogeneizar. Si alguien al momento de hacer preguntas quiere hacer preguntas en español, yo le traduzco, ¿sí? Lo que no puedo es traducirle a él toda la conferencia porque se van a quedar dormidos esperando la traducción, ¿sí? Okay, I'm saying that we will speak in English. I will also speak in English to introduce you and our other friend who is part of this panel, who is in Chile. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to those who are here in person. Welcome to those who are online. We have the pleasure today to have Kevin Zhang with us. Kevin is, well, he's a lawyer and a philosopher. He studied philosophy at Oxford University and at Princeton. And now he is, after his second master's degree, I think, in law at Yale Law School. And he's visiting us as part of this connection we have between Palermo and Yale Law School, including what we call the linkage program, which is an exchange of law students from Palermo and from Yale who, well, every year, 3-4 students from Palermo go to Yale for a month. They are, some of them are here, and to take classes, to know people, and we do the same with Yale students who come here. And Kevin is one of the, I think, 6 students are coming this year. Well, he, as I said, I mean, he's not the regular student. He has already a couple of very important degrees, and he's after another one. So, well, we are also very glad to have Verónica Undurraga. Okay, I shouldn't look at the screen because the camera is there. So we have Verónica Undurraga, who is also an old friend of many of us here. Verónica is a professor at Universidad Adolfo Ibañez in Chile, at the law school. And very important, she was the president of the expert commission of the second constitutional making process that actually Kevin will talk about. So we are very privileged to have here not only one of the most prominent professors in Chile on constitutional law and also, I think, family law and other topics, but she was also a very important figure in the process we are going to discuss today. So, and Verónica and Kevin, they know each other because Kevin has been in Chile, I think, doing some research for this paper. So I think we will have a very rich and interesting exchange. We have also some friends online, like Professor Martin Bomer. Hi, Martin. Thank you for being there. And many other people are online, like 23 people at this point. Okay, so the format is the following. We will listen to Kevin for about 30 minutes. I mean, the paper he will talk about was distributed in advance, but maybe some of you were not able to read it, or maybe it's good to listen to him to present his ideas for 30 minutes. Then I will invite Verónica to comment on Kevin's presentation. I'm not sure if Verónica will speak in Spanish or in English. We'll see. And then we'll start with questions and answers part of the meeting, okay? So I think that's enough for presentations. So Kevin, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Saba, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. I really want to thank Professor Saba, Professor Bomer, and especially Professor Owen Fiss back at Yale for taking an act of faith in a random guy from Maryland, me. But it's my first time in Argentina, and I'm very happy to be here. I like to joke with my friends. I'm 1/3 Chinese, 1/3 American, and 1/3 Chilean, but I've only just arrived to Argentina, so you can work on it. So as you know, I'm here to talk about the Chilean constitutional processes and the purpose of a constitution. And I thought I would divide my remarks in 3 parts. The first part will just be to narrate and recount what exactly happened in Chile, both from the initial protests that spurred the constitutional processes, as well as to understand some of the facts on the ground with regard to both processes. Then the second part will be to comment on the design of constitutional processes. What can be learned from the Chilean processes, perhaps what was good about them, and perhaps what was deficient in them, and led to both rejections from 2021 to 2023. And then finally, the third part will be about the purpose of a constitution. And as we build to that final part, I'll be suggesting along the way that reflecting on design features alone has only a limited kind of result. Eventually, to really understand what happened in Chile and what ought to have happened, we have to reflect on the purpose of a constitution. And as you might anticipate, the contour of the talk will be like a crescendo, going from the very concrete at first, and then to the theoretical, as well as moving from the particular in the case of Chile, and then trying to abstract to the universal about constitution making in general. So that's the plan. So to begin with the first part, what happened in Chile? Well, as I'm sure many of you know, in October of 2019, Chile broke out into a series of remarkable protests. It all started with a small increase in metro fares, which measured in absolute terms was not that large, but then led within the span of a few weeks to 3.7 million Chileans on the streets in different cities, starting in Santiago and then spreading. For a country back then of the size of 19 million, 3.7 million is an astounding number of people on the streets. That's 20% of the whole country. And in the United States, where I come from, the largest nationwide protests on record, which were the ones following George Floyd, only brought out around 8% of the country. Granted, of course, the United States is a very big country. I think Chile's outburst was rather world historic. Why were people upset? Well, I think one of the core reasons were economic grievances. There was a dimension of economic inequality. One estimate that I read said that the top 10% of Chileans owned 80% of wealth in the country. But if you can guess, the bottom 50% owned negative 0.6% of wealth in the country because of debt. And that just shows you how much inequality there was. There were also concerns about the pension system, desires for better education, concerns with how the indigenous populations had been treated over the years, and in general, a sense for the ordinary Chilean of it being difficult to make it to the end of the month, as well as the sense that with the many promises of the political elite over the decades, it had not been bearing fruit for everyday life. And so people were upset. But what is, I think, very remarkable about what happened in Chile is not just how large the protests were, their scope, but what Chileans then chose to do with it, which is they chose to channel that 20% of the whole country on the streets into aspirations for a new constitution. And here I think there's a dual dimension to the desire for a new constitution in Chile. On the one hand, talks about having a new constitution had already been around in the country for a number of years. The constitution currently in force in Chile after the 2 processes, as well as was in the case in 2019, was originally adopted in 1980 under the dictatorship of Pinochet. And it was adopted under, it would be an understatement to say, flawed conditions of legitimacy. Now, it is the case that the Constitution had been amended a number of times since 1980, but there was always this specter of it being the Pinochet constitution with legitimacy concerns hovering over it, such that 4 years before the protests began, President Bachelet had already made comments about that and initiated certain kinds of conversations around replacing the constitution. So on the one hand, there was this desire to escape the specter of the Pinochet constitution. On the other hand, of course, people had grievances and they weren't happy with the existing order. And in a way, they saw the constitution as a vehicle for change, perhaps a way to solve some of the social issues, political issues in Chile, and in a simple phrase, to make people's lives better. And that is pretty remarkable. And as you might imagine, moments like this do not come cheaply in a country's history, with millions of people out on the streets and that kind of momentum. So President Piñera, the president at the time, and who recently passed away, recognized the grievances and very soon after opened a process for having a new constitution. And about 1 year later, in 2020, in the fall, Chileans voted in favor of a new constitution, overwhelmingly 78% in favor of having a new constitution. Now, a very important caveat, which will become relevant later when we reflect on what happened in Chile, is that this initial plebiscite was a non-mandatory vote. And so only 51% of Chileans turned out for this. But among those who came, 78% wanted the constitution. And not only that, there was also a question in that plebiscite about how the new constitution would be written. Would members of Congress be involved? And 79% of that same voting body said, no, we want a directly elected body to write a new constitution. A real gesture towards direct democracy in the constitution-making process. Well, what happened next? Now we're in the first process of constitution-making. There was a 155-member constitutional convention that was convened, all directly elected as people wanted. And these people came from all walks of life. They weren't just from the political elite, but there was a chess player, people who held ordinary jobs. There was also certain remarkable procedural features of the constitutional process. In the 155-member body, there was gender parity, which, as Owen Fisk points out, is very world historic in the history of constitution making. There were also special slots reserved for the indigenous. And indeed, the Constitutional Convention eventually came to be headed by an indigenous woman who made it on time 100. So it was a very path-breaking process. And what did this 155-member council do? Well, they produced a path-breaking constitution. They produced one of the most ambitious, longest, and most progressive constitutional drafts in world history, with 388 articles that would have enshrined more rights known to any charter in world history. It would have many rights on, say, climate and animals, but also many rights about culturally appropriate food, and passages on the sky being clear and what the state must do with regard to that. It would have replaced the Senate with a chamber of regions, established a plurinational state, and other very bold suggestions. At the same time, in the process, there were certain moments of messiness, which then critics of the process seized on. For example, one delegate dressed up as Pikachu during the meetings. Another delegate, because some of this was happening during the Zoom time, voted from the shower. And finally, a third faked having cancer and later admitted to that being false. And so it was therefore both very inspiring that there were so many members of the Constitutional Convention who were from ordinary walks of life, but there were also these moments where critics could latch onto and say that this was not fully dignified as people would expect. What happened after the convention worked from July 2021 to July 2022? Well, in September 2022, after debates and campaigning over it, the first constitutional draft, this very ambitious one, was rejected by a vote of 62% against. And note, very importantly, this time there was mandatory voting. And so the turnout, unlike for the initial plebiscite of 51%, was now 86%. And then in September 2022, after about 3 years from the initial protests, Chile was left with no new constitution after a lot of hopes and trial. But Chileans were not ready to give up. And so in December 2022, a few months after the rejection, a new agreement was made to restart a second process. And bearing in mind some of the experiences from the first, this time in the very inception of the design, there were certain institutional guardrails meant to be put in place. For instance, there were 12 principles that were supposed to guide the process and which could not be deviated from. There would be a 14-member body that would ensure that the eventual Constitutional Council would stick to these principles. Although these principles still left plenty of latitude for different ways the Constitution could go. And very importantly, there would be in the initial drafting an experts commission of 24 legal scholars, again with gender parity and representing different sides of the political spectrum with ideological balance. And I really want to thank Professor and President Undurraga for being here. Last year, actually this month in May, I was with her, sitting behind her in the Chilean Senate building, and she was so gracious and so generous and so kind. And so it's really an honor for, as I said, a random guy from Maryland to be here talking with you. And so also in the second process, instead of having a 155-member convention, it would be a bit smaller, only 50 this time. And so you might think that these sorts of institutional guardrails would make things a bit better. But the key thing that happened in the second process is when that 50-member Constitutional Council, which would take the draft from the initial drafting from the experts commission and then do what they want with it, when they were elected, there was a surprise result, which is that the right in Chile was able to take a majority of those seats on the council, in large part led by Cast, who had formed the Republican Party, and they were able to have a clear majority. And so then what happened? Well, beginning with the experts commission, they produced what in my mind was, and in many observers' mind was, a very elegant and moderated draft. It was by no means a purely minimal constitution. It had 211 articles, including a lot of substantive provisions. But it was this beautiful draft, in my view, that was the result of compromise between these legal scholars who acted in good faith and worked hard on it from both the Chilean left and the Chilean right. And when they released their draft in around May and June of last year, the time I was in Chile, it was, in a way, an open question what the elected 50-member Constitutional Council would do with it. Of course, people knew that it was going to be dominated by the Chilean right, but President Boric had said at the time of the elections, I hope you will not make the same mistakes we made in the first process. Well, what they did is that they did make the draft more conservative, changing many of the provisions, adding stronger provisions on abortion, private property, the status of international treaties, cementing aspects of the pension system, and more. And according to one estimate, only 22.6% of the original experts draft was kept intact. And so the large majority of the draft was changed. And when they finished their work, it was put to a plebiscite again in December 2023, just a number of months ago, and again, rejection. This time, 56% of people against, with a mandatory vote turnout 84%. And so that's the story of what happened. 4 years after millions of people were on the streets and many high hopes for a new constitution, Chile now has the same constitution. Although, if one is being precise, certain rules in the constitution were changed concurrently during this process to actually lower the threshold for amendment, which is an interesting thing we could discuss. But the key question to ask now is what happened? Why did both constitutional processes lead to rejection? And this is a particularly striking question, in my opinion, because it's quite rare. So for instance, from one study, from 1789 to 2016, surveying all the constitutional proposals that had been made then, only 6% resulted in rejections, a very, very small minority. And bear in mind that in Chile, it was not just once, but twice in a row that they rejected it. And there's one commentator who says that this is the first time on contemporary record that a country has rejected 2 drafts in a row. So that's quite remarkable, especially given too that Latin America has very much been a hub for adopting new constitutions. And so now we're moving to the second part of the talk, which is to ask a bit about the design of the processes and to try to understand a bit better what happened and what can be learned. And, you know, the thing I want to say at the outset is I think in explaining a result like this, there's always going to be more than one cause. And so I think we should be wary to try to find a single monolithic cause that explains any one particular result in a contingent situation. For instance, I think the effects of public campaigning were relevant in both processes. I also think fatigue from the voter in the second process was quite relevant. You know, a lot of hopes were high during the first time, and now they were going again. And from my conversations with ordinary Chileans, as well as some of the polling, it struck me that some of them were kind of clocked out, we would say, from the process. There's also something to be said about reactionary voting, by which I mean voting not in favor of some particular thing after you've studied exactly what's on the table, but because you're upset with something, a kind of no vote, which I think is relevant. And I also wonder, after the experts draft was sent to the Constitutional Council in the second time, whether there was entirely good faith in that 50-member council. And by that, I mean, you know, Cast had at one point said that Chile didn't need a new constitution. And so now with the Chilean right in charge of the ultimate second draft, you know, like how much of a loss would it be if the existing constitution were simply preserved? And similarly, with the left in a minority in the second process, exactly how open were they to really working there? I think these factors and more are all relevant. But with those caveats made, I do want to point to, I think, a central problem in both processes, which we can call the problem of dissonance. Dissonance between who? Well, between the people who had voted in the plebiscites and the drafters. Basically, the problem of dissonance is one where a discrepancy arises between what the drafters come up with and what the ordinary people are eventually willing to accept. And as you can see in both processes, granting that there were many factors involved, the ultimate reject votes say that the ordinary people did not like the drafts that were produced, despite the fact that they had signaled in the non-mandatory vote in the beginning that they did want a new constitution. In the first process, arguably, the draft created was too far to the left. It was ambitious, but it was too progressive for the midpoint of the country. And arguably, something similar could be said for the second process, but this time a bit too far to the right. Some of that characterization is disputable, and I think some would dispute that, but we could discuss that. What's going on with the problem of dissonance? What gives rise to it? Well, I think one thing is something I touched on just a moment ago, which is reactionary voting. Reactionary voting, I think, is not a phenomenon unique just to Chile or any particular country. I think it can happen anywhere. But I think it manifested in Chile in a number of times. When people had grievances during the protests of October 2019, they voted for a very, very ambitious council. They said, yes, let's elect ordinary people to this 155-member body and really change the country. We don't like what's going on now. We don't like the promises of the political elite, which have not borne fruit for us. But then when it got too ambitious, they said, no, we're not going to have that. And then by the time of the election of the Second Constitutional Council, when Boric was less popular, they said, no, we're going to vote for the right, in a way which could be interpreted as a protest vote against the left. And then when they were fatigued by the process and were tired with the right, they said no to the second draft. So this is always a working interpretation of what's going on when people vote. And the particular risk here with reactionary voting, which causes the problem of dissonance, is that drafters may overread their mandate. You know, if someone votes for you on the basis of something they don't like, but not necessarily of something positive you have in mind, you may interpret your election like, we've been given a majority on the council now as the right in the second time, or we have this ambitious possibility in the first time as, yeah, I've been given a mandate. We've been given a mandate to really do that. But really people were upset with something else, and this can cause a risk for dissonance, maybe. But also, I think it must be said that reactionary voting aside, the problem of dissonance is just a risk that's always inherent to when you give latitude to a drafting body. Because if you say ultimately you can go wherever you want with this, they can ultimately go wherever they want with this. And though it's true that especially in the first process, they held many listening sessions with the people to solicit ideas and things like that, that's no guarantee that the draft produced will reflect the midpoint of the country or something that will be acceptable to everyone. And so in other words, there's always this temptation to go far because constitutional moments don't come cheap, as we pointed out. And so I say that openness to the problem of dissonance is a possibility from the design of the process that we have to be attentive to, because I think it is in part related to why the process is failed. How am I doing on time, Professor Saba?
Oh, you have like 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes.
10, 15.
Perfect. What I want to do now, still staying within the second segment of the talk on design, is to consider a few possible takeaways just from what we've said so far. And these are takeaways that people have made commenting on the situation. And what I'm going to eventually say is that maybe there are some good points behind all of these ideas, but all of them are ultimately very limited in their appeal, as in they cannot be a decisive solution in themselves. So one thing people sometimes say is that, well, Chile never needed to fully replace their constitution. They never needed a totally new constitution. People have this idea that the constitution could solve a bunch of problems, but that's not really what the constitution is for. And in fact, people will say in the same breath, maybe it's better just to amend the constitution over time. Indeed, as Chile's current constitution has been amended since 1980 many times. And here in Argentina, you have a constitution all the way back to 1853 that's been amended many times, especially in 1994. And honestly, I think there's something to be said for this. These arguments often turn on the idea of increasing legitimacy by amendment. For example, Jaime Arancibia has a book on the Chilean Constitution, which kind of shows you all the proportions, all the portions of the Constitution that extend back to different drafts over time. And it can contribute to the idea of an enduring political order by not wanting to just shift the whole thing so easily. But at the same time, I think these calls that, oh, Chile just didn't need a new constitution at all, miss two things, which have to be balanced as counterpoints. First, that in the Chilean context, there was either real or perceived, but probably both in some measure, the idea that they needed to escape the Pinochet, the specter of the Pinochet constitution. And that is a kind of shadow that follows the original legitimacy of the constitution. That was one of the motives for many people to replace it. And the second is, constitutional moments that are not cheap present an opportunity. And so even if in other times you could go for gradual amendment, why not think big if you handle that bigness well? And you might think, for instance, in the American context, what if they had said when they realized the Articles of Confederation were not working well, that, oh, well, let's just amend it bit by bit instead of, let's have a new constitution. I think that would have been quite different. Okay, I'm going to zoom through some of the other possible upshots. There are a few that touch on the democratic ideas of designing a constitutional process. Some people have said, especially Professor Roberto from Argentina, that there could be more citizen input, like in the model of Ireland and Iceland. And I think these are good ideas, and I think some of them were reflected in some of the Chilean processes. But I think ultimately they are not a necessary guarantee that you can escape the problem of dissonance or that you can write a good constitution. And so I think in a way, the main question still has to be addressed, even if you just increase citizen input. If you were to go more radical, you could say, voters could vote on every provision at once. This way there would be no dissonance. But I think there are serious problems of feasibility here. And also you have to keep in mind that you want to build a coherent constitution, not one that's kind of, one menu item at a time. One idea that I think is quite important is to match the mandatory nature of the initial plebiscite with the eventual exit plebiscite. This way, two things. First, you can have greater sureness that people actually want a new constitution going in, instead of 51% of people voting. And second, if you have more people voting, maybe people will feel more invested in the process. Alternatively, one could suggest cutting democracy. The problem is that it was too democratic. Let's just have experts drafted. I think that's bad to go too top down. And there would be losses of legitimacy there, I think. And others have said, one of the problems with the process are that we should have had more substantive agreement in the beginning of the process. That way there'd be less latitude. And in a way, that's a good point. But in a way, it also misses the point, which is that's exactly the thing we need a solution to, how to get more substantive agreement. And so I think it still leaves the question hanging. Finally, one might recommend, if there's a problem of taking the draft too far in one direction, why don't we increase the threshold for agreement in the drafting process to say 80%? And I think that while I can understand that idea, it comes with some flaws. One is you have to realize in the Chilean processes, the thresholds already were quite high. In the first process, it was 2/3. In the second process, it was 3/5. And also, if you make it too high, you might make matters too thin and have problems of gridlock where every proposal is blocked. So I think that idea also comes with its pitfalls. In other words, here's where I'm going with all of this. While it's useful to meditate on what could be improved about design, ultimately, just tinkering with design is going to have limited appeal because you cannot necessarily ensure a good result just through making a good design process. And this brings us to our last section of the talk, which is that we need to reflect on the deeper purpose of having a constitution in the first place. And that might help us unlock some keys. So in a way, when people ask, how should we write a constitution? What should be the processes of constitution making? That misses out on a question which is prior, which is, what is the point of a constitution? You can't know the best means to something, to some end, if you don't know what your end is. And what I want to say is that we should argue against two conceptions of a constitution. One I call the momentary constitution, and another I call the contested constitution. And what we should go for is what we could call an enduring constitution or a constitutive constitution. And in a way, I think part of the deeper problem in the Chilean processes were that the stewards, the drafters themselves, were implicitly committed to either the momentary constitution or, probably more is the case, the contested constitution. Here's what I mean by all of this. The momentary constitution was advocated for most prominently by Thomas Jefferson. He said that we should replace a constitution every 19 years because why should we have, the old stuff governing every new generation? And actually, very spectacularly and remarkably, some empirical studies in the last few years have shown that the average lifespan of a constitution is in fact 19 years. Isn't that funny? And well, you can imagine Jefferson's argument. It's good to keep things up to date, things like that. But I think there are two very serious problems with conceiving of a constitution in this way. The first is that it does not contribute to the rule of law or a culture that would support the rule of law among both officials and the people. And that's for a simple reason. When you have a very constant shift in the basic legal order, that doesn't engender the relevant kinds of beliefs and attitudes that make the rule of law function. For instance, if a court is going to make an order, but a decade later, the very fundamental structure of that court is going to change, that's going to cause a kind of instability in the minds of the people, but also the officials. Second, replacing a constitution so easily erodes the distinction between ordinary politics and some kind of higher identity for the country. And of course, there's a lot to be said on that topic. It's a big topic. But I think it's worth there being something to cling to for a country when there's otherwise deep disagreement. And in a way, disagreement is inherent to political life. You're never going to have a situation where a lot of people are trying to live together and there's no disagreement. And so when every round, everything is at stake, I don't think that's great for the stability or endurance of a country. That's against the momentary constitution. What about a contested constitution? Well, you can understand what a contested constitution is by the name. It's having a constitution that has contested political provisions in it, but which from the minds of the drafters are very good provisions, ardently held provisions. And the rationale is very simple. We have a chance to save the world. Let's do it. Let's improve people's lives. And I think in both processes, people were committed to this kind of conception. But I think, number one, when you make a contested constitution, it's less likely to pass, as you saw in the Chilean case. And also, even if it were to pass, I think it would obscure, again, how ordinary politics would function. When you have very contested provisions, you put them high up there, and now they're harder to touch. But people didn't agree on it in the first place. That's why it's contested. I think that comes with certain risks. I think it also increases the likelihood a constitution would be replaced, which then circles back to the arguments against a contested constitution. And finally, it's just not representative. If you're a citizen of some country and you look to your constitution and say, that doesn't reflect my beliefs, I don't think that's a great thing in itself. And so what should we have? An enduring constitution, I say. An enduring constitution tries to constitute the country as a unity. That doesn't mean everyone agreeing to every provision in the constitution. Of course, that isn't going to happen ever. But it's to create a house for a big, rambunctious bunch, one in which everyone can belong. And I think intrinsically, that's both what a constitution is, constituere, to establish or set up, and instrumentally, it also helps for the long-term resolution of disagreement in an orderly, peaceful, and stable way. The idea is not to solve every problem at once, but to create a basis or a house to solve problems. And I think key to this idea is forging common ground, not just finding common ground, but forging it, in which when you put two metals in, you get something bigger out of it. And I think key here is that constitutional drafters must have a certain kind of wisdom, long-term perspective, and we would say phronesis, to sometimes show the people something more than they even know. This is not what Roberto Gardarella calls the synthesis approach, which is just finding the minimum common denominator between current poles. But it's reaching for what Rawls called overlapping consensus, a moral conception, something that can bring stability for a long time to come. This may be different for each country, what a constitution looks like, and it can be filled with substance. It's not just the idea that a constitution should be super minimal. And I say, and by the way, when I made these remarks, I did not know that Professor and President Undurraga would be commenting. So this is not just meant as a pure compliment, but it is in fact one. I thought that the experts commission and their work approached the idea of an enduring constitution, one that sought to find the midpoint of the country through compromise. And I witnessed a beautiful moment sitting behind Professor Undurraga last year when voting on some of the final articles in a subcommittee meeting. She literally would hand chocolates across the table to members from the other side. And I just thought it was so poignant and beautiful, and people really worked together. And it was an elegant, moderated constitution. And so I think Chile came close, but I think the Constitutional Council did not preserve it. And there's an open question of if they had tried to preserve it, what would have happened? But let me conclude. As I said, this talk would be a crescendo from the particular to the abstract. I don't think there was any lack of courage among the Chilean people, any lack of inclusivity, any lack of democratic process, or any lack of heart. But rather, the diagnosis here given both tries to explain what happened and explain the rejections, as well as to provide a prescription for future constitutional drafting. And the core idea is that sometimes in moments of constitutional drafting, you need some patience, long-termism, waiting, and wisdom. And instead of trying to seize the moment for just your side, you have to try to find and forge the common ground for a country. And in that way, you will not just freeze the particular moment for many generations to come, but you will transcend the particular moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for making such a rich paper in only 30 minutes. And now we'll ask Verónica Undurraga, our friend from Chile, to make some comments. Verónica, you have the time you want, but let's say something about 10, 15 minutes, and then we open the floor for questions to both of you. Verónica.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Well,
Yes.
Thank you very much, Roberto and Diego, for organizing this. And of course, thank you very much, Kevin, for your interest in the Chilean processes and your generosity in regarding your words in commenting the work of the expert commission. It was such a frustrating process that we went through, that every time someone, and increasingly many more people are doing that, someone realizes the importance of what of having got to an agreement that among experts that represented the whole spectrum of political parties, how important that was. I think much more important than the content maybe of the draft of the expert committee. It feels it feels very, very good. So thank you very much for that, and for a very, very interesting and very well researched and very well written paper. So, well, I will begin with my comments. The paper advances two central claims. I agree with the second one and only partially agree with the first one, but I think that I partially agree with the first one in the way that is explained in the abstract, but you are much more nuanced in the body of the text. So maybe you should revise the abstract, because it doesn't match with what you say in the body of the text, and I agree much more with what you really developed in your article. So the second central claim, which I agree with, is that the stewards of the drafting process, of the second drafting process in the second part of the drafting process, so the people of the council sought to I don't understand my handprint. So it's to embed the Constitution with a set of contested political commitments instead of forging an essential common ground that would create a unified fabric for the country. I completely agree with that claim. I don't agree with the first claim in the way that is announced in the abstract, which says that the design of the process failed to create mechanisms that would induce compromise and moderation. I don't think that there was a problem of design in the second process. Actually, I have to say that it's the third process. At least I take to be the first process, the one that President Bachelet led back in 2016. I think that was a very important process to consider in this whole journey, constitutional journey that the country had gone through. But let's talk about only as if the last one was the second process. I think that the design was very carefully thought through and considered almost all the mechanisms that the literature recommended for post-sovereign constitutional making processes. You know, the committee that drafted this, that designed the process, were very knowledgeable of that literature, and I think that that they put like everything that they followed the recipe, you know. So we had the 12 principles that were inspired in this principles for the South African Constitution, and they were very heavily negotiated, these 12 principles, because they gave assurance to all sides of the political spectrum that their main worries will be addressed in a way that will be acceptable for them. But then we had, as you said, an arbitration body that would enforce the 12 principles if necessary. We had the Supreme Court with a mandate to intervene if the rules of procedures were violated. We had a reasonable high quorum to approve the norms. We have a final vote on the whole Constitution. So the provisions were voted first in commissions, then by the plenary, and then the whole Constitution had to be voted as a whole. Then we had the expert commission to write a draft. So it's similar to a kind of interim constitution or something like that. And then very important, and I think maybe you think to you will want to think to add this to your paper. The expert commission had a second mandate, and not only to write the draft, the draft, a complete draft that will be then reviewed by the elected council, but at the end, when the council had its own proposal, we had the proposal went to the expert committee, and the expert committee had to make observations to that draft. And those observations had to be agreed upon by all the members of the expert commission by a vote of 3/5. And then the council will vote on that. And this is a rule that is very interesting. And the council could approve those observations by 3/5, or could reject those observations by 2/3. And if they didn't reach either the quorum for approval or rejection, which happened actually with several provisions, then a mixed commission was formed with half of the members from the council and half of the members from the expert commission, all of them with voting rights. And so those two extra mechanisms that you may want to add to your paper were and did prove to be a moderating mechanism. So that's why they are important to your paper, and they work like that. At least we made, and the expert commission made, I think it was 211 observations to the proposal of the council. So many provisions were moderated there. So there was also a reasonable design of public participation process with different mechanisms of public participation and with feedbacks at different stages. And this was a process that was led by the universities, by a network of universities, and I think that worked pretty well. But there were two. I think that there were two elements of the design that in my view are more maybe subject to criticisms, which is was it a good idea to have an exit plebiscite or not? And something that not many people put attention on is the rules that of inhabilitation. How do you say that? That it means that if you were a candidate to the council, or if you were a member of the expert commission, you are not able to run for any kind of public candidacy, political candidacy for the next 4 years. So I think that rule, which meant to have people on those bodies that were not worried about their immediate political career, had a bad consequence, because we either had like very old people or people who didn't have enough political experience at the council. It didn't affect much, I think, the integration of the expert commission, but I did think that affected the quality of the council. And even the first process had many features of post-sovereign constitutional processes, as Sergio Verdugo developed that argument in an article. For example, and there they had the 2/3 quorum to approve the provisions. That is very high, and the right accepted an elected convention because it was everyone. We were all pretty sure that the right would have more than 2/3 of the seats at the convention. It was a completely surprise for everyone that it didn't. But also it had other mechanisms that would ensure that this was not a kind of process made under the idea of an original, completely original constitutional body, the constitutional theory behind. But none of these problems were there were problems in the first process. As you said, the entry and the exit plebiscite had different rules, mandatory and voluntary vote, and I think that was a very important problem. Also, there was a problem because the electoral rules for that process allowed independents, list of independents. So that made that almost 70% of the integration of that convention were members that were independent and with very little political institutional experience. And that was a problem. I don't know if we could have done otherwise because the political class was so discredited that I think that was the only way to go, but it had consequences. And also there were problems with the idea of the convention writing its own rules of procedures, which took like 3 months. And I think that was also a problem. But none of these problems of the first process were repeated on the last process. The design was right, I think. So we have to look more, as the paper finally does, I think, to more endogenous or different causes for the failure. And here I totally agree with you, Kevin, in that the stewards of the last process did not understand the purpose of the Constitution. And let me rectify it. I think they did understand. It was a lesson that we learned from the first process. Everybody, even the president, when it inaugurated the first session of the council, said, please do not repeat the mistake we made in writing a partisan constitution. Everyone was pleading for that, but their goals were to use the process as a political platform for their leaders who wants to be president in the next election and who wants to elect their people for the municipal and parliamentary election too. So this was deliberate. It was completely deliberate. It was a decision. And about the purpose of the Constitution, I think that the paper presents us with a very important question, not only for Chile, but generally. And I am thinking about academics and activists, for example, in the United States, that are thinking about proposing a constitutional process in the US now. So my question is it possible these days to forge a common ground, to constitute a country as a unity, to have a constitutional process that will produce an enduring constitution to which citizens can cling onto in moments of division? Would a good design or a clear purpose and leadership will be enough to make that possible? And this has to do with your very interesting point about reactionary voting, on page 23. About that, in Chile, maybe I would say about reactionary voting that maybe you should think, I think the idea is very good, but maybe you should think about it differently, at least in the case of Chile, because I don't think that people thought that the first proposal, or at least it was not the only thing they thought about the first proposal, that it was too left-wing, and that the second proposal was too right-wing. But I think that they distrust the people who were writing, or the bodies who were writing the Constitution. They distrust the political class. In the first process, there was a lot of hope because this body seemed different. But in the process, as you said, that it was very messy. Finally, what people said was they are the same thing, you know, that politicians, they are all fighting each other. They cannot agree on anything. You know, so maybe is the reactionary vote is not because the proposals were not on the middle ground, but because there is a total disconnection between the citizens and any kind of political representatives, you know. So, and another question would be, if we answer the former question, the one that is it possible these days to forge a common ground constitution, if we answer that former question with no, because if it is too risky, or it risks destabilizing politics and deepening divisions, is the alternative to gradually amend the Constitution is it really an alternative? Remember that in Chile, we amended more than 50 times the constitutions, beginning 1989, but it was a very elitist discussion, and the amendments did not address nothing relevant to the social unrest. But also there's another thing. It is difficult to substantially distinguish sometimes between amendment and replacement. For example, the Argentinian Constitution was amended, but materially or substantially, I would say that it was replaced in a sense. It made a huge difference. You know, it completely changed the spirit, I think, of the former Constitution. So maybe you have to attend more to the substance than to the process, distinguishing amendments and replacement. I don't know how will you deal with that, but there's something there that I think you should explore. I have some issues with your portrait of the council's proposals. I think you are too generous with it, even if you point to criticism. But of course, I realize that I have a bias because I don't share the substantive points. But I would say that it's important to stress the difference between the expert committee draft and the council draft was that the expert committee draft was what we called a constitución habilitante. So what we meant by that, and we were very clear about that, and we always mentioned that. And yeah, enabling constitution. So what we meant by that is that different governments would be able to pursue their substantive political policies under that umbrella constitution. That doesn't mean, as you say, that it was a minimal constitution, but the substantive agreements will be broad and will enable different kind of right-wing and left-wing policies, and that is the big difference with the with the council's draft is not that you say, well, there are good things here, bad things there, but that draft really was a complete left people who share left wing ideologies completely out of the text. Then on your discussion on momentary constitutions and the claim that the constitutions should stay up to date versus the idea of an enduring constitution, I had a comment, but now when you explained your paper, I think I read it. I made a mistake in the reading, because when I read, I didn't realize that you were making a difference between momentary constitution and contested constitution. So my comment was, be careful, because it's not the same thing. Don't conflate it. But now I realize that it was my mistake in the reading. And again, an enduring or a lasting constitution can be very flexible and change in time, and be very and could be a very different material constitution through time. So these categories are tricky too, and that was one of the problems with the current constitution, the Constitución de 1980, is that it was reformed many times, but we felt that the material constitution there, that the neoliberal,
substance
of the constitution remained, even though it was reformed many times. I think that it would be let me see. Okay. Well, and finally, thank you for your kind paragraphs on chocolates. I shared so many chocolates and cookies and cakes and sushis and everything during the process. I think those kind of those kind of gestures are important. Always. Food and culture unites people, so that's good. And also your general's title of that part, which says, "When Chile almost approached an enduring constitution," referring to the work of the expert commission. I do think that what we did was very challenging. It was by no means clear that we would achieve we would be able to have a draft constitution. It was very difficult. We were we negotiated in 2 blocks of 12 people each, and we didn't divide it. And we decided from the outset, and this was not part of the previous design, but we decided from the outset that since the first that none of the 2 groups will divide. I was told by the vice president, and he's a very smart person, and he said, "Verónica, do not try to get, don't even try to get the 2 votes that you will need from our side to have the 3/5 that you need to approve a provision, because we will not give you the 2 votes you need." And I said the same thing. So we sat down and we said, well, how we will end with a draft then? Well, we will share the pen? And that was the expression we used. Will we share the pen and we will negotiate and we will write every provision together, you know, first in subcommissions, and it was not a small commission of the 24 that will take the important decisions, but all of us worked on 4 commissions that you visited, and then the other decision was to try to approve the provisions by a large majority, and we did that almost unanimously for almost all the provisions. And the only way that we could do that was with a very important commitment to the purpose of the drafting process. We were writing a constitution, we were writing the rules of the games, and we were not playing the game. We were not doing ordinary politics. And I think that we all had that very, very clear. So your point on purpose was very important. Now I'm writing a paper that I hope that I will be able to present at CELA, that showing how we were, the expert, we were very tensionados, I would say we were, during the second part of the process, between keeping that spirit and also, I don't know, keeping that spirit during the second part. Well, it was very challenging. We made it, and the comments we received all the time was, "I'm so relieved that you showed that it was possible. It can be done. Thank you very much." But I'm not idealizing that. I'm totally aware that at the time we were working, the citizens were very detached of the process. I'm not sure that, as you said, that we won't, that even if the council will keep that spirit, I think that the Constitution would have been approved if the council had kept that spirit, and if everyone from the right to the left would have called for an approval. But I'm not sure. I think it would have happened, but I'm not sure. So well, that's it. And I think that the Constitution, I don't know. So, and I think we just comment to the first thing you said when you began your explanation, that about that 20% of the country were on the streets and during the estallido social. Now, many people, and the right is treating all the people who were on the street, saying these were criminals, these were violentists, and so now we have. I think that the process left many scars, and it will take time to. It will take time to heal, so thank you very much for trying to think on over this process, because that is what we have to do now. We have to think a lot and take all the learnings from those processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Verónica. Well, thank you very much for this privilege of having this zoom into the last process, and by someone who was such an important figure in that process. Thank you so much. Well, we'll start the conversation now. We have already one question there, but I will use the privilege of being the moderator to ask the first question, so I give time to my colleagues and friends to think about other questions. I think that one of the main idea of the paper is a very important one, which is this idea, I think, if I read it well, that for designing the process of changing the Constitution, you need some sort of clarity on what is the purpose of the Constitution. I would say not only the purpose, but what is the Constitution? What is the Constitution? What is the Constitution for? And your point is that if we don't answer that question first, we cannot design a proper process to change the Constitution. So in some sense, if I understand you well, I think that you have in mind a certain kind of process for a certain idea of Constitution. You have an idea of Constitution, a Constitution as an agreement that unite or expresses the unity of the country, of the people, and then you have to design a process for reaching common ground in order to achieve that unity. But I think you also think that a certain particular content of the Constitution is also in your mind. And for that, you also need some idea of what a Constitution is for. I don't know if I'm unclear. I mean, you think that the process, the design of the process, is determined by the idea of Constitution, but you also have an idea of what kind of content the Constitution should have in accordance with that idea of Constitution. And I think there's a tension here, because if you have a certain content in mind, I wonder what is the relevance of that process. If you rely on a certain process, you shouldn't have any kind of content in mind. I mean, anything that comes out of that process should be consistent with your idea of Constitution. I have more questions, but I don't want to, take advantage of my position. But I have a very simple question for Verónica too, which is, as Kevin said, after these two processes, Chileans ended up with the same Constitution that was in place before those two processes, and that made so many people unhappy in the country. So I wonder what is going to happen. I mean, what's happening today? What is your relationship with the Constitution? I don't like to call it the Pinochet Constitution, because there's something else, as you said. I mean, there were many reforms, but you also said that those reforms didn't change the substance of the Constitution. So what is next? How you live under a Constitution that so many people believe is not representing, as Kevin said, your ideas? I mean, people don't reflect in that Constitution. So how can you manage from now on? So if you can answer these two very short questions in a few minutes. So I open the floor. There's already one question in the chat, and I see, you don't see, but Veronica, there are like 20 something people here too. So I think we will have many questions. So Kevin, you want to start?
Yes, thank you so much. And I'll be very brief. But I just want to say, Professor Undurraga, thank you for your wonderful, really helpful, really excellent comments. I think you're basically right on all scores, and Professor Saba for that great question. I'm going to say something brief that comments on both at once, which is, in a way, the overarching idea is to have a legitimate aim towards a good constitution that encapsulates this purpose. And that comes with this thing you describe as attention. In one way, the purpose has implications for how to do the design, but in a way, it also says the purpose is kind of independent of the design, in the sense that no matter how good the design is, ultimately the drafters have to have the purpose in mind, or the design is not going to get you anywhere. And on that note, I think, Professor Undurraga, you're totally right that one of the claims in the abstract is overstated, because as you point out, like many of the good proposals for design were exhausted in the second process. But in spite of that, and I think you point out correctly the issue of good faith in the stewards of the second process, like the political dimension to that, that exemplifies the whole point that no matter how good the design is, you need the guiding purpose in the minds of the drafters. And so I just wanted to say that. Yeah.
Thank you. Verónica, you want to address my simple question?
It is not that simple. Well, but now we are beginning to have many conversations, for example, on reforms to the political system, for example, because there is an agreement that that we have a lot of blocking bloqueos in Congress and between Congress and the executive, and so many important laws cannot be approved. So it's almost urgent to change the political the rules of the political system and to amend the Constitution for that end, and all the proposals are taking the draft of the expert commission as the working paper for that, I would say. And also we, for example, I'm participating on another group who which is working on judicial nominations, for example. And so some of the members of the expert commission are part of that group. So I think that there might be room for some amendments, but I would say that, well, the political atmosphere here is very polarized, as in many other countries. So that's why my question is it possible? Is it advisable in this kind of political climate to think about changing the Constitution and in Chile even amending the Constitution? And that goes for the US and other countries as well. And what I think that in Chile, the main, I would say, challenge is to make a good reading of what is happening. I'm very worried. I'm much more worried about how the political malaise or the unrest, the social unrest has been criminalized now. And I think that if we don't take it seriously, we will have a social unrest again soon. And I don't know what will happen then. So that is my worry now.
Thank you. Okay. Questions, comments. Si quieren hacer una pregunta en español, yo traduzco, ¿sí? Voy a hacer lo posible. No soy traductor, pero voy a tratar.
Hay una en el chat también.
Sí, quería ver si, bueno, piensen preguntas. There's a question in the chat that says whether the question is for both of you, whether you think that the different bodies involved in the process, in both processes, had enough time to work on a text of the importance of a constitution, whether I think that it's kind of suggesting that the time frame wasn't appropriate for the task. So I don't know if Kevin or Verónica wants to elaborate.
Since I have nothing to say about it, I'll just say it has never struck me as a central factor, but.
Verónica?
Well, I think that in the first, I think 1 year is reasonable. And both processes had, well, no, in the second process it was from March to November. So it was less than 1 year. It was very straight, but it was possible. It was not, I agree with Kevin, it was not the main problem. In the first process, I think that 1 year was okay, but the convention spent 3 months of that year discussing on the rules of procedures, which was not a good thing, I think. But I think 1 year is reasonable. You cannot extend those processes too much.
I think also there's like a countervailing risk, which is the attention span of the populace can sometimes not be the longest, so making it too long comes with its own shortcomings.
Yeah, and the second process you said, I mean, there was fatigue because of the first process. So, okay, yes.
So first of all, thanks, Kevin. I really like the paper. I love your question as well. That was super clear. So I agree with the more substantive claims of your paper. There are some procedural features that you suggest are usually suggested to tackle the problem of dissonance. And one is getting the people substantially involved in the drafting process, as in like in the Iceland or Ireland case. So you say that this is not necessarily connected to the success of the convention. You understand the success, and let me know if I'm misquoting you, as both passing a constitution and passing a good one. So you claim that as demonstrated in the first process, it doesn't necessarily lead to success. Now, can it be the case that in the Chilean case, there was not a specific mandate, that the social outburst was more a claim against the status quo than a concrete 4 or 5 specific demands from the people to the state or the government or the constitutional convention? Can it be the case that it was more an expression of protesting against what there was rather than asking for concrete solutions?
Yeah, I think on the on that basically like empirical question about interpreting what people wanted, I think it was both concrete, like economic inequality, grievances, education, environment, pensions, indigenous, and at the same time, in virtue of that being all the things, not concrete. That's one of the interesting things about it. Now, how that intersects with the idea that crowdsourcing ideas for a constitution, or maybe having like a lottery of citizens who gets a lot of influence in the process, how that relates is a really interesting question. Like the vagueness of the demands with the kind of bottom-up drafting approach, worthy of exploration.
Yeah, Federico.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you for your paper. I really enjoyed it. And my question is related to an argument you made against a contested constitution. You cite you say that for obvious reasons, the contested constitution is likely to wear against the unity of a country. And what a constitution is the most fundamental factor for the legal and political order of a country, when the document represents a set of normative commitments that are too extreme for most citizens of a country, it will become difficult for them to look up to the founder. And what I was thinking is that if the Constitution is drafted with this purpose in mind, the drafters try to achieve a minimal or moderate constitution, the political battles that you don't win, because since they are out of the purpose of the Constitution, let's say you remove any debate or question about contested rights, they will find a way in the courts. Lawyers will also look up to the Constitution as a common ground, and they will claim that, I don't know, there is a right to have an abortion, even though it wasn't allowed or debated, it will still find a way as some word trickery like substantive silence. And so I guess my question is, have you thought about reasons in favor of settling
highly contested debates or topics instead of avoiding them, given that lawyers would still try to claim that they are part of the constitutional fabric?
Yeah, this is really great, and nice to see you too, Fede. No, I think that's really insightful. Like, basically, I take your observation to be that even if the constitutional text seems more mild, like the clever lawyer will sneak anything they want into the kind of elevated echelon of argument rather than ordinary politics, as exemplified by substantive due process and other things. I think that's accurate, like as a prediction and empirical claim. The question is whether that fact cuts in favor of putting like really explicit and contested provisions into the Constitution. I think even if you do so, people will similarly contest them. I actually think in the Chilean case on abortion before, like there's a discussion to be had on this, like before any of this drafting started. But I guess as an immediate answer, but I'd like to think more about this, I don't see how the possibility of always elevating anything into a constitutional argument cuts in favor of making the Constitution itself more contested. And can I just say one thing on Professor Undurraga's question of today, like, is it possible these days? And I don't know, but I just wanted to say that I feel it's never been easy to forge common ground. I think, I mean, people can have their thoughts on the American Constitution, but I think, like, from the perspective of the drafters then, it was not easy to forge common ground either. And it then took a lot of persuasion as well after the text was written. And this whole topic of persuasion is one that only shows up very briefly in the paper, but there's a footnote to Plato's Laws 4 as well. I think it's tied to the problem of dissonance, because in a way, the problem of dissonance is not just a one-way or a one-time kind of thing. I think sometimes, I mean, in the American case, they really championed the Constitution and changed minds even after the drafting process was complete. But I think the difficulty is what makes it difficult, but also is what makes it remarkable when one does forge common ground. I ask the experts.
Yeah.
Martin will have a question.
He wants me to read it, or you want to talk, Martin? You want me to read it? He likes to have assistance, so I read it. Okay, to Kevin and or Veronica. What about constitutional adjudication by the courts? Were the courts reluctant to assume a more active role during all these years in order to make the Constitution closer to the ideals of liberal democracy? And if they were, was that an issue in both the pressure on the drafters to, there's something that, to be too clear, unambiguous, and in that sense, push towards polarization? If we trust the courts to make a better job, wouldn't the drafters have used a more ambiguous, more open language that would have permitted agreement and a path forward for a deliberative practice? I think there's some connection to Federico's point. So, is that clear? Okay. So I think it's for both of you to react to that. Veronica, you want to start?
Yes. Thank you, Martin, for that question. I think it's so important. Actually, I was about to make a comment on this, precisely on this point, because I think it's really very important. Yes, the courts, of course, during the years, especially under democratic governments, of the years that we had lived under the 1980 Constitution, things have changed. During the time, the time of the dictatorship, the whole legal doctrine was, constitutional legal jurisprudence and doctrine was built by people who were from the right. And so they really built a whole body of doctrine and jurisprudence that has been very difficult to dismantle. But especially ordinary courts have done that, especially on issues on children's rights, family law, for example, things like that. And we have had the resistance. Generally, in the Constitutional Court, it has been much more difficult. The Constitutional Court had become very political. The nominations of the justices of the Constitutional Courts are highly political, and it's very and so there, first the right-wing doctrine prevailed, but then in the last years we have had also some variations of that jurisprudence. So when the council took office, you could see, well, during the whole process, really, what we were all the time drafting provisions, thinking about the interpretation that had been given to the constitutions. So we had all the decisions like in our minds, you know. And one of the things that we were fighting all the time, for example, was to change the language, because the right wanted a language that would be like very similar in the important provisions that will that were the central to you know, the economic system and to their idea of liberties and all that. They wanted to preserve the wording of those provisions because they were clear, and we were clear, that if they preserve the same wording of the 1980 Constitution, probably the jurisprudence will follow the same line. So, if we change the language, then the court will have to say, well, if they change the language because they meant something, you know, they want to change this line of jurisprudence. So we were all the time fighting against those ghosts, you know, and this was, especially in the expert commission, we tried to change the language thinking, trying to like kind of dismantle the idea of a neoliberal constitution, material constitution, and create the language that will enable for a social democratic state. You know, that was our main purpose. And then when the council took office, they wrote very, very precise amendments that you could trace to all the decisions of the court that had had opened an interpretation of the Constitution that would broaden the meaning of those provisions. And it was very clear. You could identify the decisions of the Constitutional Court that they were fighting against, and of the Supreme Court as well. So your question is very much on point.
Thank you, Veronica. Any other? I have a lot of questions, so I want to give you some space. Shall I step on you? Okay. Good. I have three comments, or not exactly questions, but I think 3 things that we can discuss. The first one is that in Kevin's paper, what happened in 2019 seems to be the beginning of the process. You said later that it wasn't, but I just wanted to point out that the process didn't start in 2019. I think that Veronica referred to Bachelet's contribution to this process. I mean, that it started much earlier, and I think Bachelet was trying to build up a moment through instilling a discussion at the civil society level that then at some point was aborted by, because of external reasons, let's say. I mean, corruption accusations of some people in the government or lack of popularity of the president. I don't know, you tell us. But I think that that's one thing that I just wanted to point out, that 2019 wasn't the beginning, it wasn't the big bang. I mean, the second comment, I think, is related to this last point that Martin including in his question and Veronica's answer. I think that the ambiguity of the Chilean process has to do with the fact that it wasn't a revolutionary moment that allows for a radical change in Constitution. Because Veronica was saying that when you were drafting, you were thinking in the constitutional practice that existed already. So you were not just trying, it wasn't South Africa after the apartheid. It wasn't Eastern European constitutions after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was something different. In some way, you were trying to change completely the constitutional framework, but at the same time, you were not in the middle of a revolution. You were, in some place in between these two situations. And the last comment to trigger some comments by you is something that was said already, but when Kevin said that common ground was the main goal of this process, or should be the main goal of this process, the question is common ground among who? No, I mean, Veronica said the two processes happen in the middle of a profound distrust of the political leadership. In fact, the first process involved in the council or the assembly people who, I mean, I think you said 80% of the people in the council or in the assembly were not coming from political parties, were independent. And this fact makes the process also different from other processes. For instance, I'm thinking in the Argentinian reform of 1994, in which parties were crucial in reaching agreements. And although they were not completely, making people excited, but at least there was still some sense of these people were representing, some will. Although there was also a lot of participation around the assembly by civil society organizations that were, trying to influence the more formal process, and they were successful in many respects. But the Chilean process is happening in the middle of this profound distrust in the political leadership. But at the same time, it's not what Gargarella is thinking about, which is, let's make a process that is coming from the bottom up. Having citizens participating. This is not what happened either. So I don't know, just if you have any reactions to these 3 points, and we'll continue.
Yeah, very briefly. I thank both of you for this point about the Big Bang not being 2019. This is really helpful, and I think it's interesting if the narration shifts earlier, what the implications are. And I think tied into this, something we haven't discussed is the particular moment in October 2019 when Piñera decided to initiate, like that particular political moment being on a very tough day of the protests. I think that's, and exactly like to what end Piñera saw the function of opening a constitutional process rather than, say, using more force. I think that's all very relevant and in a way showcases the kind of contingent facts that are relevant to even a small second Big Bang. Well, not so small, but let's, if we were to call it a second Big Bang. I think your second point is really interesting. I don't have anything to say about it now, but in terms of common ground among who, it's a great and big question, and the big but vague answer is, I guess, the people. That's not to say the people should necessarily be drafting it. And that's also not to say that the people will not change their views during the years of drafting. But I think it is ultimately them who must be able to live in the house. Yeah.
Veronica, you want to say something?
Yes, sure. Thank you for this excellent question. Well, Bachelor's process ended with a draft too. So, for example, when I teach constitutional law, sometimes I made the students look at the same provision in the 1980 Constitution, in the bachelor's draft, in the first convention draft, in the expert commission, and in the second convention draft. So I work with 5 constitutional proposals. So it's not that it was it ended in a draft, but I think she had a very good idea of the need of a constitutional conversation, but not even her coalition followed her. And now everybody is very repentant about that, because we have things would have been very different by then. And I think that Kevin is very right, pointing to the importance of the moment in which Piñera and the parties, many parties in Congress, decided for an institutional exit to the very, very difficult moment we were living in November 1990, 2019, I'm sorry. I think that at least the continuation of the government was in question, and even I think that even democracy was in danger, because the alternative was to take the military and to the streets and to have a estado de sitio with nobody would have known what would happen then. So I think that is something to be very, very proud of. I would say it's the 3rd time that Chile does that. The first time was, I think that to find an institutional, exit to a problem. The first one was, it was the first country to elect a socialist president through the vote. That was impressive. It was not through arms, which was the way that people thought that socialists would get into government at that time. We did it through the vote. Then through the vote, we returned to democracy using the same rules that the Pinochet gave in his constitution. And now through the vote, we exited a very, very dangerous political crisis. So I think that is remarkable. On the question on common ground among whom, that is very interesting, because I think that 70% of independence and at the convention was really a problem. These were people who had most of them were they were prepared people. If you compare with the common population, many with university studies and all that, but many were activists for one cause, or they were very for environment, or for women's rights, or for animal rights, and so it was very difficult to have a political conversation on that, and they were with the spirit of it's now or never, if we don't do it now, we will never do it, and so the spirit was it was very difficult to make them think on the purpose of a constitution that will be a home for everyone. But my experience with political parties, I had never been a militant of a political parties. I was nominated by one of them, but I had no political experience as a militant, was that the degradation of political parties, it was very difficult to deal with them because you press them saying, well, what is your position on this issue? And the position was decided according to the polls, you know? And so, for example, the traditional, the right in the Constitutional Council had 33 of 50 votes. So it not only had 3/5, but it had only the 2/3 as well to reject the observations of the expert committee in the expert commission on the second round. So they could do anything they wanted, and they did. But the traditional right had 11 votes. So the traditional right could have stopped the alt-right party, which had 22 of the 50 votes. So if the traditional right that had behaved very well in their representative in the expert commission had wanted, they could have stopped the alt-right from changing everything, you know, and pursuing their substantive goals and using the process as a presidential platform, you know. But they didn't, and they didn't because within the parties of the traditional right, half of their militants were more alt-right than the alt-right. So you cannot trust that a political party will have an ideology that it will defend. They are like very, I don't know, in a sense, it was very difficult to deal with political parties that didn't really have a position on substantial issues, you know. So among whom it's very difficult. It's not independence, but also these kind of political parties were not working as well.
Thank you. Okay, last call. Anyone? No? Well, thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you very much, Veronica. Thanks everybody here. Thank you for a great conversation that really, to have the chance to know more about the Chilean process and to learn how the Chilean process and the ideas that were shared by Kevin can help us to think about other countries' processes and some constitutional theory problems. So thank you so much.
Muchas gracias, un gusto. Thank you, Kevin.
I think we have to say goodbye also to our friends online. And I think that in some days, the recording of this conversation will be in the Palermo University website. Okay, thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Professor Undurraga.
Thank you.